Hello, everyone, and welcome to You Normal. I'm your host, Robina Benyon, and this is the place that we get to push into the conversation around what exactly is normal. I have conversations about people's own journey and rediscovery, and really redefining what normal is to them because it is as unique as your fingerprint. So today, my guest is Melissa Seligman. She is an end of life doula and has spent many years walking with families around grief, trauma, and kind of end of life conversations, if you will, suicide, combat PTSD. And we're going to be discussing some of that today. So, welcome, Melissa, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Rabina, for having me. I'm very grateful to be here.
Thank you. Well, Melissa, I know that this is a what people would deem to be a heavy topic, and it
Mhm.
is. I don't want to say that it's not. For those of you joining us, whether it be right now or in the future, I was introduced to Melissa through the Conscious Dying Institute, where I recently became an end of life doula. Melissa is an end of life doula, but you're also an educator
Mhm.
around discussing this topic. And when I heard you talk, Melissa, it was really powerful. But there were two things that I wanted to make sure that we incorporated into today. The first being, because even if this is us talking and we're presenting this on LinkedIn, there is a ritual around it. And you reminded me of the importance of lighting a candle. So I have a candle here today, and I want to light this for our conversation, for all of the families and individuals that struggle with suicide,
Mhm.
traumatic death, and grief, and all of that, because um, you know that I don't want that to go unspoken in this moment, and to welcome those people into the conversation.
Mm. Thank you.
And before we get going, and I have you share a little bit, is you also shared the importance of grounding ourselves, and that we are going to be talking about some things that could bring up trauma within people to trigger that. And so,
Mhm.
if you will, before we go, can you help or can you walk you and I through a little bit of a grounding exercise, but also for anybody who may be hearing this?
Oh, absolutely. And for yourself and for me and for anyone else listening, I think it's incredibly important that you take care of yourself as we go on this journey to get today together and talk about these difficult topics. As sometimes I believe and think, even for myself, that I'm beyond something or past it, and something can trigger me, and I'm immediately, right back in that moment. So I just want to say up front, if you find that happening for yourself, that's completely normal, and that it's okay to just take a minute and recenter and do what you need to do. What I like to do, and do you actually want to go through a couple of minutes of grounding?
Yeah, let's do that. I
Okay.
think it's important.
What I like to do is to be barefoot. I'm barefoot now. I think I'm barefoot 99% of my life
Same.
because I feel very connected, to the earth, and any opportunity that I have, especially in having these discussions, I like to have my feet firmly on the floor and to feel what's beneath me.
Mm.
And if you do want to close your eyes and just take a moment to breathe, just a couple of deep breaths. And feel the ground beneath you. Feel how present it is, available, supportive. Feel the warmth of your feet as it interacts and the floor comes up to meet the bottoms of your feet. Just take a couple of deep breaths in gratitude for this kind of support today, for your body, for your mind, for your heart. And also just take a moment and feel into your body. Maybe you even want to touch your legs with your hands. Put one hand in the other and clasp it and feel that presence, that awareness. And just take a couple of moments to breathe into gratitude for this body, for being here and being available to you and supporting you while you take this journey with your mind and your heart. Just take a few more deep breaths with me here. And as we open our eyes to rejoin, just remember that this is available to you at any time. Anytime you need to stop, anytime you need to remember that your feet are here in this moment, present in the now. And if you even need to move your feet around just to have that sensation, to take your brain, give your brain a break for just a second and let your feet do some work. It's a wonderful way to stay very present and available.
Mm. Oh, thank you for that. And even for me, I love walking through those exercises, and it was very powerful. And it was like, it was a reminder because I could almost feel the energy, the roots of the earth coming up to kind of say, I got you, like hold your feet. You're getting ready to be blown away. So you're
Yeah.
good. Um, but you said something in there also that I think is a wonderful reminder, and was that to prepare for the journey that your mind is about to go on, right? Because sometimes it's really easy to get pulled into the belief that we're really in it in the moment, right? Like that we're
Mhm.
walking through maybe some of that trauma or grief that it could arise in this conversation, but just to remember, like it's a journey of the mind. We're
Mhm.
not in that moment. But before we get going, because there's so much that I do want to discuss, I briefly want to just pause and have you share with the people who are watching again now or in the future a little bit about yourself and how you have arrived at the journey of being an end of life doula and an
Mhm.
educator and supporting people around what I believe are really actually sacred parts of life.
Thank you. It's kind of a rambling story because it seems that I'm a jack of all trades. But when people ask me when I became a death doula or why I did, I like to say it wasn't really something I chose. It was something that chose me. My first, sudden death or traumatic experience was at 6 years old. And as I tried to step back and really recount a lot of the deaths that happened amongst my peers or in childhood, many of them were suicide.
Mm.
And that just kind of, I think, set the journey forward for me. And because I was so young with my first death experience, I also think that it gave me the gift of not really having a formed opinion yet, but being able to be present and in that space almost with a childlike sense of awe.
Yes.
So that sadness was certainly available to me, but um, also curiosity and beauty and very ethereal experiences. And along with those suicide experiences, I also encountered a lot of shame and guilt and silence around that. So at a very young age, I was also experiencing what it was like to have deep pain that wasn't being recognized or understood. From there, as moving into my professional life, my prior life was an English. I was an English teacher, and I married my husband, and he decided he wanted to go active duty in the Army. And for anybody who's been in the military, especially as a partner, hiring a military partner is not really something that happens, especially if you are pregnant, because they know you're going to move every 2 years. So finding a job teaching was incredibly difficult for me. And
Mm.
as he deployed more and more, it became more important to me to be home with my children as they worked through those deployments and I worked through those deployments. And during that time, I decided to write a book. It was something that I've always wanted to do. And at the time, it definitely wasn't a book. It was my journal.
Mm.
And it was essentially what it was like to experience deployments as a family member, as a partner, the reality of that, the grief involved in that. And at the time, I didn't realize really what I was doing or how fortuitous this would be. But I broke my book up into the original Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's original 5 stages of grief to
Mm.
talk about what a deployment felt like. And at the time, I didn't realize I was writing about disenfranchised grief, anticipatory grief, and I was terrified to put it out. There's a lot of pressure in the military to be a good military wife, and I was certain that I wasn't if I told the truth about how hard it was.
I
But
think by the way, I think I have a membership card in that club of feeling like I didn't do it very well. So
yes, yes. Oh my gosh. Like there's so much pressure around it that I don't even know if people know they're putting on
Mhm.
us, but it's very much there. And for me, it felt like something that had to be addressed. I had to say it, but I also wasn't hearing anyone else say it at the time.
Mhm.
So my book came out in 2008, so we're still, kind of relatively newer in those deployments.
Yeah.
And what I found was this massive amount of people came forward and started saying those two amazing words of "Me Too." And
Mhm.
they kept coming forward. And so I decided for his third deployment that I would blog live time essentially and created a website. And from there, that led to people asking for retreats for military partners. And so I started there to doing holistic retreats with a therapeutic support for military partners, just to start that dialogue and to get it out there and to help people understand, what we were going through and that we did need support and we did need help. From there, that moved into working with Gold Star families, parents, partners, children, as the wars progressed, and then as they progressed even more, working with caregivers in various different forms.
And real quick, Melissa, like because I'm married to a military man, I understand. But for those who don't, can you
Mm,
just briefly say what a Gold Star member is?
absolutely. A Gold Star member is someone who lost someone in combat.
Mhm.
There are all kinds of different stars in the military. Recently they've also added White Star, which I'm grateful for. That means that you lost someone to suicide.
Oh,
And a blue star, meaning that you are active duty. And often, if you see a blue star hanging in the window, meaning that you have someone serving and potentially deployed at that time.
yeah,
So there are all kinds of indicators and these little codes in the military that I think, especially people not in the military, it's a whole different language,
yeah.
entirely different.
Yeah,
Um,
thank you. I just wanted to share because I know I wore a pin once in a
mhm,
while that had a star for my husband when he was deployed. And you see them like the ribbons sometimes people will have on the car.
yeah.
And yeah, to know what that gold star means is, I think, pretty powerful thing to be aware of and what that person's walking with. So thank you for
Yes.
sharing that.
Oh, absolutely. And thank you for stopping me to ask. I find myself, I slip back into military language so easily. Thank you for
Yeah.
helping me to clarify that. So from there, then I moved into doing a lot of suicide work because, as the wars progressed, we went from partners of deployed people to caregivers to wounded warriors to suicide. And it just became more and more in terms of what people were coming forward with and needing and wanting help with. My husband is 100% disabled, so I am his caregiver, and he was medically retired from the military. Oh my gosh, I think 6 years ago. It feels like a little bit of a time warp.
Mhm.
And we moved to Asheville, North Carolina, and I retired 3 years ago from leading retreats so that I could be home with him and also home with my children as they moved into their teenage years. So I didn't really go looking for end of life death doula options. It kind of fell in my lap, and when I started to look at what it meant, I realized that that's what I've been doing my whole life. Between sitting with people as they died, sitting with a lot of older people in nursing homes, very endearing and beautiful time in my life to sit with them at such a young age as they died, and then also to work with so much traumatic grief as well as having so many suicides in my own life, that I was working through. it just felt like a natural fit. And so I did the training and, got the certificate and went on to become a conscious dying educator. So I've gone from educating to educating, which is, kind of lovely. I appreciate that training for sure now. But everything else has been kind of a windy path. But since I was 6 years old, it's been death for sure.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and our paths are so different in that I've had a few people die, that were close to me, but not very much, very different. But I was with my grandmother when she passed away, um, it, and I always remember it. It was like such a beautiful thing. But the interesting thing is how I remember it is different than what actually happened. So it's
Yes.
kind of I reflect on that. For me, so my grandmother was home, she came home and she was in hospice care, and she had a bed set up next to the sliding glass door next to her bed.
Mm.
And but every time I think about it, I still see my grandma laying in the middle of her bed, and I feel like I had been sitting there studying just like, quietly, and I got up and left, and when I came back, it was she was taking her final breaths, and I believe she was waiting for me to get out of her bed. She was like, "Rabina, get out of my bed. I'm ready to go."
Mm-hmm.
Um, but going back to what you were sharing is one of the things that really caught me was talking about military
Mm.
PTSD, the grief and the suicide, being that I shared with you, I've been a military wife for a really long time, been through multiple deployments. And by the way, I think even talking about deployments, it's easy sometimes, I think, to slip into like, oh, they're just going, like a 1 year deployment, right? You can't go on a
Mm-hmm.
1 year deployment. No, this is going into war, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're being deployed into where they're going into danger. And so compartmentalizing all of what's happening, being a wife and a mother, working a job, all of that. And I think just to bring it back to one of your points that you said is nobody was having the conversations. And
Yes.
I remember that when my husband was deployed, and it was probably one of the, he wasn't even, he had already been to Iraq twice. And this was I would say a less dangerous one deployment. But I was really impacted by it. And I think
Mm-hmm.
because of the other couple of ones that I had been through, I mean, I lost count how many I've been through.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a part of me that was like, what is going on with me? And I was like, but it was like, am I suffering from PTSD? But I felt like so shameful to say that because how dare I take anything away from the soldiers? But here I had
Mm-hmm.
been operating on a couple hours sleep. You never know when the phone's going to ring. I'm supposed to talk to my husband and then I don't hear from him. So then I have no idea what's happening. Plus I'm caring for two babies. It's like in this constant um, survival mode, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so I think just giving voice to that again, not to take away from what the soldiers go through, what your husband went through, and I want to talk about that, but also to say for the spouses that are out there, there is also that I don't know what would you define it, the trauma that we do go through in those situations.
100%, 100%, because trauma by definition is anything too fast and too much. And deployments, oh my gosh, you never know when they were going, if they were going, and then sometimes they came home and then they leave again, and it's just a constant state of being in survival mode and a heightened sense of awareness. So at the point that you're in a heightened sense of awareness for such extended amount of time, that absolutely is traumatic. And I think what's incredibly important about that is, I hear you on that, in terms of PTSD. I do have PTSD myself. It's from a different situation, but those deployments absolutely ignited it because a second trauma will ignite your first. So, when you talk about it was a relatively easier deployment, or, it wasn't as dangerous, that gave you the space to feel those feelings again, which brought back everything. And it's crazy making almost, because
Mhm.
you think you're moving forward and then you feel like you're jerked backwards and you don't know what happened. So even getting one of the things I'm really proud of in creating Her War, Her Voice is that we were having those conversations, and especially really encouraging military partners to own their story, that it's okay.
Mhm.
And it's okay to say, this is really hard. It's okay to say, I have PTSD if if you feel like you can say that. And I also understand the nerves behind it. But for sure, I want to absolutely validate any military person. You have secondary PTSD. I can, pretty much guarantee if you've gone through these wars, you have trauma that you're working with and working through.
Yeah. Well, and even in light of just our life in general, you have law enforcement families,
Yes.
healthcare workers. So there's, that can show up in different areas and not just the military anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
so,
Well,
and one of,
especially
go ahead.
Well, especially in our healthcare workers now, because I think one of the things that's been so interesting about COVID, and I don't know if this has felt the same for you, but to me, it has felt like a deployment. The unending, you don't know if you can be with your person if they're dying, or even just not being able to get to them, trying to help your kids navigate through all of this, not being able to have any answers, and then also feeling scared yourself, all the way around. So, everything about COVID for me as a military person, I kept wanting to get out there on the soapbox and be like, this feels like a deployment. It is valid. It is okay that you feel crazy.
Mhm.
This is traumatic. This is collective trauma that we're
Yeah,
experiencing. And I think as military partners, we were experiencing collective trauma. And because we were experiencing it together and still are experiencing it together, it's harder to see that individualized story because we're all being dipped into the boiling water together. So it
right.
makes it difficult. But for anybody who's wondering about COVID, it's just as hard as a deployment. So I hope that makes you feel a little bit better.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and there's that in both of them. There's the unknown. You could say, "Oh, when is he coming home?" or "When is she coming home?" for those who
Yeah.
have, and it's like, well, I think, but there's no guarantee. So you never have that
Mhm.
solid date that that somebody's coming home. And then my
Yeah.
husband was in the guard, so it was always like, okay,
Mm.
you have your pre-mob beforehand. So then he's gone a month or two before deployment. Then he was gone the whole deployment. And then they come back and demob, which is demobilization. And so then he was still gone after. So it
Yes.
was always this fluid date where I really didn't have an end in mind. And that's COVID, right? Like you
Yes.
said, but we've all collectively been walking through it and just kind of holding our breath of like, is it okay? Is it not okay?
Yes. Yes. Are we going to make it? Are we not going to make it? When's this going to be
Right.
over? And you have kids asking you, "Can I do this?" And you're like, "Actually, I'm sorry, you can't. We have to cancel that."
Right.
There's a lot that's gone into this, and I keep trying to say as much as I can from my space to validate that, and it's going
Yeah.
to take a while to come out of it. It's there are going to be a lot of emotions and a lot of confusing thoughts and confusing elements coming out of that. So this is a place where I feel like military families have an opportunity to be in that microphone and normalize what this is and what it feels like and what trauma feels like as you're surviving it and going through it. And I certainly feel for our healthcare workers. They're already in emergency room situations where they're experiencing trauma, but to then have the entire healthcare system going through that, it is my hope that we're being very well aware and preparing for what it's like for them when they come out.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I think with that kind of following on this, Melissa, is when I went back in and listened again to the sharing that you did in the Conscious Dying Institute, one of the things that you mentioned was, let me look at it, is you said you talked about our body resurrecting the trauma, right? The trauma is stored in our body.
Mhm.
And it doesn't always that trigger doesn't it's not always the thing that you think, right? Where
Mhm.
like I said, I just with this final deployment that he had really wasn't that big, but for me it really was. It was probably one of the harder ones that I walked through because
Mhm.
I'd already the one before that was when I completely shut down. So then you get to this next one, but after it was really interesting is I remember we went to a Memorial Day festival that they were doing, if you call it that, not a ceremony or whatever gathering.
Mhm.
And there was a wife there who was sharing about a run, and it was in honor of her husband.
Mhm.
And so I went up and I was talking to her, and the date that he had been killed in Iraq was the date that my husband and like our boys said goodbye to him.
Mhm.
And it was the first day, like my son took a step. I remember that day so clearly. And so to have this moment come in where I realized that her life changed completely in a different way on that day, it was so unexpected. I just started crying and I was like,
Mhm.
what is going on? Like, why? She's the one who lost her husband and I am crying. And it's just, I think, when I heard you say that and how it just comes up, you never know when it's going to. It can be the smallest thing. It was
Mhm.
as if in that moment, my body was just like releasing everything. Well, not everything, but a lot of what it had been hanging on to for so many years in those deployments.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so with that, whether like you've had a similar experience, seen it, or just if you want to talk about even more how our bodies hang on to that trauma and how it may show up unexpectedly, or even I think about, often we could be in a very professional setting and we're not able, it's not, to like say, for example, if that had happened to me in a boardroom or something, how do you navigate those situations when it shows up in your life?
Mhm. Um, well, I think I want to answer that one first in terms of my own personal opinion and handling those situations. I think the more humanity we can bring to those moments and the more awareness we can bring to those moments, the more we can normalize that. So, given in a boardroom, as embarrassing as it might feel and as terrifying as that is, and you can push through. And this is what my partner with her war originally when we started together would say to me, you can do it, you just don't want to. And that is a wonderful distinction in that moment. But any way to normalize trauma, and for myself, I've had to get very vocal and say, I'm sorry, I'm having a panic attack right now, and I'm just going to work through that. And you don't need to do anything. Just know that I have my tools and I'm here and I'm working through it. Then hopefully, the more we can normalize that for other people. However, it is an incredibly terrifying thing when it happens, when those flashbacks pull forward. And I do want to start off by saying I am not a therapist and I'm not a trauma expert. I've just had the privilege of working with trauma experts for the last 15 years and just soaking off them and absorbing everything that they've given me and offered and working with me. But one of the biggest things to understand about trauma is when a traumatic event is happening, you dissociate. And that's anything that's too much too fast. So a lot of people think that this could be a natural disaster or this is a deployment or this is a war situation because for the longest time, PTSD has really only been given a lot of attention around veterans. But PTSD can happen when there's a prolonged experience of anything too much too fast. So I just want to very much normalize that if you've wondered, oh my gosh, do I have PTSD? Do I not have PTSD? In the long run, the diagnosis may make you feel validated. However, if it's happening, and that's your reality.
Mhm.
But what will happen is that your brain dissociates essentially. It takes off because it's like, this is too much for us to process. I can't handle it. I can't deal with it. But your body stays and absorbs everything that's happening so that when the situation is over, then the brain will come back. But it's not really connected. It didn't really, exist there with you as your body was absorbing it. So there are moments where you will be triggered, and those usually come in sensory forms, like the five senses, and that's all bodily related. So something like a smell could send you right back, and you don't even know you went back. And all of a sudden, your body and your brain and your mind are bringing forward these images or that situation, or all of a sudden you're having a panic attack and you're not quite sure why. And it's because your body always remembers what
Mhm.
happened and it will protect you at all costs. And this is one of the things that I like to say for myself, especially when this is happening, is that my body is pretty amazing and it's always going to protect me and do its absolute very best. So because it's been stimulated, and because your brain has had this experience, then you're in that, like people like to call it the lizard brain. You're essentially in that fight or flight immediately, and your
Mhm.
brain's like, what in the world just happened? Why am I all of a sudden sweating? And why is this happening? So as you start to heal, one of the things that you'll realize, and there's so many different modalities in terms of healing. And I do also want to say that a PTSD diagnosis in no way means that you're broken or that you're not healing.
Right.
Um, so as you start to heal and your brain comes back to your body, you have to essentially create that story again and put that story together. And that's where the healing happens. And that's in the present moment. And trauma needs witness and it needs voice, it needs story. And it needs some form of witness to say, yes, that absolutely happened. Yes, you are a valid person. Yes, you are important and you matter. And ideally, I'd love for that to be a person, some good person saying that to you.
Right.
But that's what happens. And something like Dr. Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps a Score, which is an excellent resource, really goes into depth in terms of how the body absorbs trauma. And then Resme Menekem's book, My Grandmother's Hands, I think is probably one of the better books I've ever read in terms of helping you understand what it means to metabolize trauma versus have
Mhm.
trauma. And then also look at ancestral trauma, which is incredibly interesting to me and very important to me. But he also provides exercises, to do with your body as you're reading the book, because there are a couple of places where he's like, imagine yourself in this situation. And my heart rate started going. He's like, if your heart rate's going, here are some exercises.
Mhm.
So it's, a very practical book as well. But that's what happens. That's what flashbacks are. They're essentially your body bringing attention to, hey, this happened to us and we need to figure it out. We need to heal from it.
Yeah, well, we've seen the shows, right? When someone comes back from war, Vietnam is a pretty common one in shows, and I think even more recent wars. But that can be there can be a thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I
Mm-hmm.
remember even being in a movie with my boyfriend at the time, and we were watching Pearl Harbor, and it
Oh, yeah.
and it triggered something from when he was in Somalia, so you never know when it's going to show up. But
Yeah.
you said a couple of things, and I want to touch on them. There's two. So you're talking about how, yeah, I agree, the body, it does store the trauma, which, by the way, I'll get those books and
Yes.
share them in the post with people. um,
Mhm.
and so two is, one, like you talked about your husband and you're his caregiver, and I think just talking about that a little bit, because here you were sharing with me that he has a traumatic brain injury. And so, but
Mhm.
yet you're helping him to heal what is stored in his body. And the other thing, and this was discussed in the other conversation, is I think moving from that in the body and into also being with people in grief. And I do want to touch on that before we go today. But if let's kind of pause a minute and just how whatever you want to share, I guess, is I don't really have any questions about it, but what you want to share about walking through that journey with your husband and someone who has suffered a brain injury. And so their healing probably undoubtedly looks very different than my healing would look like, and
Mhm.
how I heal what's being stored in my body.
Mhm. It's in my opinion, not very well navigated so far. I think we're still learning, especially with the weapons used in the more modern wars. At the point that we have IEDs that we're looking at now,
Mhm.
there are more and more brain injuries coming back, every day. Um, and I think what matters to me so much about that is getting some awareness out there that even though my husband does have all his limbs, and traditionally when we think of caregiver, that's what we think of, as a person who doesn't have all of his or her limbs, or isn't able to function in the normal way. And there are absolutely families out there working with all internal injuries. My husband's injuries are all internal, so you can't see any of them. However, they're very real, and validating families that are going through these experiences and what it means to essentially be my husband's brain for him, and what that means to try to help him through that, as well as what that means to keep giving his autonomy, and to keep encouraging him that here are places where you can alter how you're functioning, not try to change anything, or not, but that radical acceptance of, this is who I am and I'm going to work through what that means. So we also spend a lot of time celebrating those things and celebrating those victories. And for a lot of people, I think if they were around my dinner table, they probably wouldn't find the brain jokes that we share with each other incredibly funny. But it's nice to be able to just make that part of our everyday conversation. This is just
Mhm.
our reality. But outside of our home, when you see us together, I don't necessarily get the acknowledgement that this is a real caregiving situation, and he also doesn't really get the acknowledgement that he's really wounded. So it's something that can really play with people's minds in this situation. and their hearts and their emotions. And so there's any way that I can validate and say this is really hard. And not being able to see his injury and not being able to know when it's going to strike or what it's going to be or how that's going to show up is really difficult. And there is not a lot happening in terms of treatment right now with
Mm.
TBIs. There's the diagnoses, but because we're having such a mass amount of them now, I think it's pretty hard for the VA to keep up with it as well as take care of, everyone else. And I think we need to do more. I think we
Yeah.
absolutely need to do more in understanding what this means for families and what this means for military children and for partners as they move forward, and what healing looks like, because his brain is never going to be the same. But the modalities that he's used, things like EMDR and acupuncture, and we now have, systems of tracking to know that when the weather changes, he has what we call a brain day. We know it's going to happen when there's a shift in the barometric pressure outside.
Mm.
So yeah, it's just a constant journey through that. But if there is anyone listening who is a military person who is dealing with a brain injury, you are absolutely important and you matter. And this
Mhm.
is a real wound and it's important to talk about. And those caregivers are amazing people too.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Well, and I think even as you're sharing that, the importance of the conversation, like we talk about mental health,
Hmm.
but it's really is no different than if we're treating our heart or our kidneys or our lungs. It's, very
Hmm.
an important thing. And they are so complex. I know, I've been reading more and more on like what are ways to support people differently. And you're right, because we can't see. There's so many people who are walking around with some type of trauma that is not visible.
Yeah.
And I think just having this conversation, opening it up for people to be talking about. And you're talking about modalities even. And one of the things that
Hmm.
I started doing over a year ago is breath work.
Hmm.
And I'm actually going to have my breath work coach on next month. And I'm really excited for that because of how
Yeah.
powerful it is
Hmm.
around that. So I think, I no one can judge what conversations you're having around your table. There's probably things that everybody makes jokes of, and they're like, we shouldn't joke about that. But you know what?
Hmm.
It's your family, and you said, probably haven't done it really well, but you're doing it. You're figuring it
Hmm.
out. There's not really a manual, so whatever you're doing is, it's right. You're doing what you can. You're doing the best that you can with the resources that you have.
Hmm.
And I think if anything, creating a conversation around it too is going to help somebody out there. And I am so real quick, just to pause, but your email address is on here, and I'm leaving it up the whole time because I want people that if they want to, and I'm going to put this other one down here for you as well,
Thank you.
because it is really, I mean, it's just so God, there's so much I just want to talk about around this because it is powerful. But yeah, the brain traumas and there's all forms of them. It's interesting. I hadn't really thought about like talking with you and even concussions,
Hmm.
how that really impacts, which seems so nominal, but a concussion can be really
Hmm.
disruptive to your life.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so even something minor like that, and also like you were talking about, like you could be eating an ice cream cone and you like some smell, like you said, or something's going to bring you back to that moment. And so being in support of somebody and just you not, I mean, that's even can be a lot on your system, right? You come home and
Yeah.
then now you have a family member that you have a whole other need, a whole other set of needs. And I think that goes to Melissa. I'm wondering, I'm thinking about even grief, right? Like we
Hmm.
talked about this stuff. They teach us about the 5 stages of grief, right? So you have grieving what you thought was going to be, and now you're caring for somebody who is supposed to be that comfort person for you. But when they come back, now like who do you grieve with? And and you said in the moment when you're in that, when that trauma and the grief, right, you're caring for the person, you're just being there and you're hearing them. But then when you're that person and the person who's normally there for you is, like, say for example, your husband, Like, what
Mhm.
do you like? How do you, and I'm asking you because if there's a wife or a husband out there listening, how do you handle your own grief in that? Because you have your grief in that moment, even like grief exists
Mhm.
even with someone still alive, right?
Yes. Oh my gosh, yes. Oh, I think we went through several rounds of grief every time he came home because he came home a different person and he came home to a different person. And I think that that was something I really had to work to understand because I'd been with myself the whole time. So like,
Mhm.
I haven't changed, you've changed, but I made huge adjustments and shifts. And there's grief around that. There's grief around the couple that we were. There's a grief around the relationship that we had that we can't necessarily have now. There's also a lot of grief of looking at what it means to fully process both sides of this situation, and for us to also give room for our children to be able to have their story and to be able to listen to that story and to witness that story. And I think one thing that's really important as you are addressing your own story or bringing forth your own trauma is to understand that you need the permission of the other person to hear it. And I think that that's something that
Mhm.
sometimes we skip over, especially if we're releasing or we're venting, that there is vicarious trauma. And sometimes I really have to watch the words I'm using. I really have to pay attention to the language. In the military world, we can get pretty gross sometimes. So, I really have to pay attention to what I'm sharing and what I'm saying because it can impact the other person. And for my husband, I mean, it's a very delicate balance at times because he has extreme amounts of guilt for leaving us, extreme amounts of guilt in knowing how much it hurt me, how much it hurt his kids, as well as him leaving. And we don't have the draft, so this is all voluntary, right? Like this was
Mhm.
originally his choice, and for him to step back and really see what that means. And granted, I don't think any of us knew two wars were coming and it was going to be 20 years, worth of time. There's no way he could have known that, any of us. But he ultimately has to work through that was something that he chose to do. And I also have to work through that's something that I chose to stand with him as he did. So being aware of my story is intricately impacting his story as well, and vice versa. There has to be a lot of discussion about our mental health and how we are before we have these conversations, as well as where we are in our own healing journey. And it's really important to me for me to say, like the therapist would be like, you need to start with I feel. It's really important for me to always tell him, this is not your fault. I am asking you to be my partner and hear what it was like for me. I just need you to listen to me and do nothing else. And I think the moment that I say do nothing, you don't need to do nothing, you don't need to say anything. I'm not asking you for an apology. I just need to be able to say, this was what it felt like on my end. And I think what's difficult for military partners in that way is that because we were just waiting for the next one for so long, like for myself, that didn't really come out until he was out of the army.
Mhm.
And so he was moving forward in this direction of figuring out his, future path and what it meant to move to a place we love and to be outside. And he has his freedom. And I'm all of a sudden pissed for like a year. I don't know why. So, it was also important to give myself grace that I've really been holding this for a very long time. And I also have to have a sense of trust that he is capable of holding this. That if I have held his, he is also capable of holding mine. But it does mean, having a lot of discussions, having a lot of intimate discussions, because he has been suicidal before. And that's something that very much, is on my mind at all times and how I share. And I think one of the gifts in that space is that it does ask me to stay mindful of my words, and I
Mhm.
think that that's incredibly important when communicating with someone.
Yeah. Well, I would say just even in general, we never know who has suicidal thoughts, right?
Yes,
So in your situation, it's having that awareness, but again, we don't know who's on the like what people are feeling on the
exactly.
other side in everyday life, especially with everything that we have been walking through.
Mhm.
Um, mask or no mask, like going to the
Yeah.
grocery store can be a very triggering event, but in
Mm-hmm.
what you were saying though, and walking through that, I mean, it even reminds me, it's like, oh yeah, because my husband's still doing his reserve thing and he's like, oh, I'm in a non-deployable unit. And in the back of my head, I'm like, yeah, I don't think that's ever really true.
It's not a
Right.
thing.
Because depending on how the world turns, it could change all the time. But I
Yes.
agree. When you said being mad for a year, I was like, oh, I remember one deployment, he came home. I don't even remember. I think it was when he left, the babies were 2 and 3. I was working crazy hours. We had bought a house during that time. And he came home. I was like, I want nothing to do with you. I just want to go to work and not worry about
Yeah.
anything. And I literally, like, I just don't even remember that, kind of probably at least 6 months after he came home, because I was just mentally exhausted. And it was
Mm-hmm.
like, I just need my space, but not really realizing that it was probably, I should have been talking to somebody in that moment to help me walk through that a little bit more. Because the one person that I normally would be him, which,
Mm-hmm.
and then people outside of my world, my friends, they're wonderful, but they just didn't like get what it was that I was
Right.
feeling.
Yes. Yes. That's a
Um,
difficult dynamic. That's just a difficult dynamic all the way around.
yeah.
When your friends outside the military don't know how to help you and you very much feel that they don't know how to help you, it can be a really awkward situation and conversation. And I've shut the room down plenty of times when people say, "How are you?" And I'm like, "Well, actually,
Yeah.
this is how I am." And they're
Yes.
like,
Yeah.
"Oh, okay." But one thing that I do want to say about anger specifically, and I think, I don't want to really put gender around this in any way. And I do think that women historically have had a hard time expressing anger without, coming off as an angry woman or aggressive, or having any of those feelings ourselves. Like, we don't want, I know for myself, I don't like to feel angry and I don't like to stay in anger. And it was actually my therapist who was like, but this anger is righteous and it's beautiful and it's important. And then she asked me just point blank, like, why wouldn't you be angry that you don't have the love of your life with you? Like, why
Mhm.
wouldn't that be something to be mad about? Or if he's been hurt or wounded in or any way, or coming home with PTSD, and you know that something happened, why wouldn't that make you angry? And then I had another PTSD expert who explained to me that the more intensely you're feeling those feelings, it's a direct correlation to your humanity,
Mm.
meaning something hurt you that badly because you love that well. And I
Yeah.
think that that's really important, is that anger is there because you care.
Yeah. Well, and that dovetails into what I was going to also talk to you or ask you about, to share, is that also someone said that you're like the grief mirrors your love, right? It shows that someone's life mattered.
Mhm.
And so I don't want to end today without talking about suicide,
Mhm.
because you have been exposed to it more than probably many people.
Mhm.
And I'm hearing about suicide more lately. Seems like
Yes.
more young people. Is I guess you just, I would say, for anybody out there, because it creates an awkward conversation. And you were saying, like, just to be with that person, if you find that somebody whose loved one has committed suicide, how can you be of the best support to them? And also, if, like you were saying, and I think you shared in the other one, was that your good friend committed suicide and had been at
Mhm.
your house pretty close to the time that it happened, is
Mhm.
um, also your advice for anyone around who is either in that self place themselves,
Mhm.
or they have a loved one like you, where you're navigating the day to day with someone who is struggling with that.
Mhm.
Wherever you want to go with any of that, and share what you feel is most vital, because it is an area that people shy away from. They don't want to have the conversations. I don't know what to say. I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings.
Yeah.
Which reminds me, you had great advice, was if you say something stupid, just apologize, which
Yes.
I love, because often we just like, oh, I said something stupid, let me slink away and just act like it didn't happen.
Mhm, mhm, which I have done so many times, not the slinking away, but I probably have done that too, but just saying something, I'm like, "Why did that just come out of my mouth? I don't understand." sometimes it just happens. That's actually a phenomenon, and I can't remember what it's called now, where you're like really wanting not to say something, so you say it. Um, there's so much around suicide, and my very, very dear friend was actually here the day that he died by suicide that evening. Um, and I was texting with him moments before he died, and I was texting with his wife actually as it was happening. Um, and she had no idea that this was going down either. So it's very hard to know when a person is in that space. And it's also often so encompassed by judgment or by shame or by guilt that I think sometimes people forget that we all have the capacity to at some point feel that way. And
Mhm.
I would wager, the majority of us has at some point felt that way, like that feeling of, and for me, of all the people I've known who have attempted suicide or had suicidal ideation, it isn't that they want to die. It's that they want that specific pain to stop.
Mhm.
And that is the most complete way to stop it. That is the form of control that they can have in an out of control situation. So I think one of the most important things that I want to get out there is I understand why suicide is scary. I don't think any of us want to see that happen to someone we love. We don't want to experience that ourselves. We don't want to go through that grief. And at the end of the day, suicide is only another form of death.
Mhm.
And so if we can start normalizing that this is happening and to start talking about it, then maybe we can open the space for people who are feeling this way to say, actually, yes, I feel that way. I feel the same
Mhm.
way. This is how I feel right now. This is what's happening for me. And then another thing that I'd like to say is language is incredibly important, in my opinion, around suicide. And one of the things that gets to me is hearing suicide prevention, um, because the only person who can stop a suicide is the person who dies by suicide. That is the only person who has
Mhm.
any control over that. So at the point that we're putting out suicide prevention awareness and suicide prevention, if you know someone's suicidal, do these things. And of course, yes, please do those things. Absolutely. But no, you can't prevent it.
Mhm.
So if someone you love dies by suicide and you tried or you didn't even know, please understand that you could not have prevented that, because I think that's the number one thorn that sticks in our sides is what could I have done? What could I have
Mhm.
changed? And that is the continuous loop that people can get stuck in with their pain. And as a society, we're telling them you could have done something. And
Mhm.
I just think that it makes a lot of sense to start looking at shifting our language. Um, you know, died by suicide and suicide awareness, and let's talk about suicide. Like the more we can normalize that word, then perhaps the more people we can save.
Right. That's an excellent point. Yeah, the thought of like if I was walking in that space in that moment and I hear suicide prevention, even to me that like that could potentially cause more
Yeah.
stress, I guess, or whatever negative thoughts and that someone is that's struggling with their thoughts around suicide, right? To think, oh, well, it's actually preventable. But what if it was more about around, like you said, suicide education,
Yes.
suicide awareness, and having the conversation. And honestly, like you said something about how it's trying to control, and I think what you said was they're trying to make the pain stop.
Yes.
And as like a person who's walked through plenty of pain, I know what that feeling is like. So if anything, if I'm in that moment and someone's sharing, it's like I can understand what it feels like to be in pain, right?
Yes.
And just sitting with somebody and allowing them to share is the most powerful thing, and not say anything, because oftentimes that wanting to say something is to make ourselves feel better
Yes.
by trying
Yes.
to make the other person feel better when they just
Yeah.
want to be heard.
Yeah. And I think it also sends people into a panic when someone says, I feel suicidal, because then you're immediately like, oh my God, what do I need to do? Like, how can I stop this? Because you really don't want that to happen. I mean, we just don't want our loved ones to feel that much pain, like,
Mhm.
ever. So I think, and it's certainly not every situation. I mean, there are so many different situations out there, and it's not always a mental health situation. Like there's this is a very large topic and there is no one solution or answer. In my experience, when someone tells me that, it means they trust me enough to talk about it. And if I can start seeing that as I'm a trustworthy person, and if they want me to do something, they're going to let me know. Or I can say, do you need me to do something or do you want me to listen? And giving them those little pieces of control go a long way. Like even just being able to tell you, no, I want you to do this right now. And you're like, okay, then I'll do this right now. It helps sometimes, in those ways of giving back little pieces of control, because at the end of the day, you're absolutely right. We all know what it's like to want some pain to end. That we all know that feeling. So to even remember a time when you felt alone and you were in pain, then you have enough history and background to be in a space with that person. If you are healthy enough to do that, that's a very big caveat that I want to put out there, is that it's, you also have to maintain and take care of your own mental health. And I think that's another place of guilt that shows up for a lot of people, especially when a person has been suicidal for so long and you've worked so hard and tried so hard. And there's almost a sense of relief when that struggle is over. Not that their life is over, but that the struggle is over. So much guilt can come about in that. And I think the more we can normalize this as pain and not as a choice, because I don't know that using that language is particularly helpful for anyone. And in terms of sitting with people, you ask about that, like when you're walking into a situation, I will also say, please know your own boundaries and know your own limits, and know your history well enough to know whether or not that's a space you even want to enter, because you don't want to, become the problem in that moment. That the best thing you can do is show up, especially in suicide, because there's so much stigma, guilt. People don't know what to do. They go silent, just radio silence. There's a lot of abandonment. Being able to walk into that space and just let them know, yeah, this is really hard and I'm here. That helps more than you can know.
Right. Yeah. Well, I feel like we could do a whole other hour on just like that guilt, right? That we have
Yes.
around certain things of, like you were saying, even that relief of like, you don't have to worry about it anymore. There's just so much, and supporting people. It's a whole other conversation. And maybe we'll do a part 2 on this. Maybe that would be a good thing to come back and revisit, allow some people to send in their thoughts or questions and shares of what they would like us to expand upon. So as we close, gosh, you've said so much that I just, like, there's so many nuggets I want to keep going on. But just as we close, and I do want to make sure that we reground, like kind of finish the ritual, right? Because you were saying like you ground, what you said is you ground yourself beforehand, like in your intention. And you made a great point, is you said you don't want to become a part of the problem, right? And so in that self-care, for those that are listening, is you had said like ground yourself beforehand. You don't want to ground yourself in the trauma, right? In the pain, like wait until you walk in the room. And then once you leave, you were sharing, because I think I was the one that asked you, is after to like take a moment and to ground and kind of put that back in the earth. So as we close, if you want to maybe, have a kind of closing grounding or whatever you want to do to help share that, and then we'll share how people can reach out to you.
Okay, absolutely. So if you want to just take another moment to take a deep breath, and even I think lift your shoulders and just let them fall, because I can even feel mine creeping up. So put your feet on the ground and feel that warmth and that sturdiness and the steadfastness of this earth always coming up to meet you, to welcome you, to accept whatever you need to release into it. And take a few deep breaths in gratitude for what your body has brought you through today in listening and in thinking. If you want to take a moment to just thank that body, whether you want to rub your legs or hold your hand or even pull down those shoulders a little more. Let's just take a couple of deep final breaths. And as you exhale, you are letting go of anything that is not bringing you happiness or health. Another deep inhale. With an exhale of how normal you are, worthy, important. And one final inhale. With an exhale of gratitude for this body and everything it does for you.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to open your eyes and join.
Thank you for that. So, our candle went out while we were grounding.
Yeah, well, it knew.
It did it for us. It helped us. So I thank you. And to share, I know you shared this, was even if, when you leave, you could simply get in your car, and you said, like, you just released it to the earth, right? Like, if you're in
Yeah.
a space, release it to the earth.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's a wonderful practice to go into, regardless of where you are, whether we know that it's going to be a heavy moment or not, even into meetings or with each other. So,
Mm-hmm.
Melissa, I thank you for being here with me and sharing. And I truly believe like this could be a whole other hour or two. Probably, well, you've done rituals, retreats around it.
Yeah.
But I'm sharing on here, if someone wants to know more about what you do as either an end-of-life doula, a conscious dying educator, they can reach you at melissa@rootedright.com, correct?
Yes.
And if there's anything around being, to share more about what people might reach out to you around Her War, Her Voice, and how you can support them.
That is a huge topic. I've gotten everything from someone having suicidal thoughts in the moment to, can you give me a resource to find a better place to mail this package overseas? So anything, honestly, anything on your mind, any question you have. And if I don't know the answer, I have an amazing team and we will find the answer.
Okay. Excellent. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And for anyone who's listening, I think from two military wives, if you're going through that, and maybe again, it's not the military, it's law enforcement. Maybe you were actually a child who grew up in the military, right? There's these things that we don't know when they're going to show up in life. But if you have questions, want support, curious, definitely reach out to Melissa. If you want to reach out to me, I can always reach out to Melissa. And just a reminder to know that what you are walking through, again, is as unique as your own fingerprint. And there is no right or wrong way, and doing it by somebody else's definition, that you get to define that. And if either of us can support you in that process in some form or fashion, please don't hesitate to reach out and know that you get to define your you normal. So I thank you for being here with us, for listening, and whether it be today or in the future. And thank you again to you, Melissa, for
Thank you.
sharing with the audience. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Until we meet again.
Thank you.
Yeah.